Well, hello, YouTube, and anywhere else you may be listening to or watching us. Welcome to FreeThinking Ministries, where our mission is to equip people to reason together by applying logic and sound theology to all aspects of life. As always, I'm joined by Dr. Tim Stratton. Well, not as always, but as usual, I guess. I'm joined by Dr. But we also have a special guest today, a special episode today featuring friend of the channel and New Testament scholar, Dr. Mike Licona. Thanks for joining us today, Mike.
Yeah, my pleasure, Josh. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, so a few months ago, well, I guess actually about a half a year ago, there was a widely broadcast debate on whether the Bible's true by Alex O'Connor and Dinesh D'Souza. I suppose to get into the debate, you had to have some sort of apostrophe in your name. Was that was that necessary? I don't know. So Tim and I watched it, and Tim, both of our reactions were like, okay, this is kind of interesting. It's entertaining. But the questions being asked and the responses, we were like, man, a New Testament scholar would be great to respond to these things.
I refer to it as
we know one.
Yeah, right. We do know one. And I watched the debate, and I referred to it as a train wreck. Where both sides. It kind of reminded me of when Bill Nye the Science Guy debated. Who's that? Ken Ham.
Yeah.
I'm like, that was a train wreck because they're both wrong. And I kind of felt the same way here. I felt like, here's two, I like both these guys, Alex O'Connor and Dinesh D'Souza, both, seem like nice guys, but it was just a train wreck. And I was just thinking, wow, I wish Mike Licona could have been in that room with them, but now we've got him here. So thanks for being here, brother.
You're welcome, my friend.
And in the interest of full disclosure, we had planned to do this months ago, shortly after the debate came out, but there was an opportunity perhaps for Mike to talk directly to Alex himself. Is that right, Mike?
Yeah, we were both invited to come on Unbelievable. It used to be hosted by Justin Brierley, but that's still going. It's going well, but they invited us, and that just didn't work out.
That's too bad. I really hope that a conversation between you two can happen in the near future. One thing I learned from you and from Dr. Craig, Dr. William Lane Craig, is as a scholar, we're not obligated to respond to every layperson on the internet who has strong opinions, but we are obligated as scholars. When another scholar addresses our work and wants to have a conversation with us, we have an obligation to have that conversation. So whenever there's been somebody with a PhD behind their name, or somebody with a platform like Alex is, and Alex is, I consider him now to be a scholar as he's pursuing his even more education, I believe, but he's got a degree in philosophy. But every scholar who has raised objections to my work, I have addressed them either on my website or YouTube channel, or both, or gone into debate with them. I was on the Unbelievable show myself with Alex Malpass, which was as a result of Ben Shapiro's debate with Alex O'Connor. So anyway, with all that said, I really want to encourage Alex O'Connor to have that conversation with you. One thing I really like about Alex is recently he has made it known that some of his videos that he recorded in the past, especially when he was a teenager, one in particular, he made a video going after the ontological argument, and he was very bombastic in his approach. In fact, Josh and I did a video yesterday where we were talking about this, and he has backed off from that and said, you know what, I didn't know what I was talking about when I was objecting. Well, it seems to me that he has not read your work, Mike. And if he would have been familiar with your work, I don't think he would have made the same kind of objections that he made. So I hope to see him make the same kind of concessions regarding this topic as he has with the ontological argument. And he really needs to have this conversation with you, since, in my opinion, you are the guy when it comes to gospel differences.
Well, I appreciate that. And I don't We all have different things that we are trying to accomplish, things on our plate. And, maybe Alex just had a lot of stuff on his plate at the time and couldn't make time. And I agree with you. You just can't debate or have intelligent discussions with everyone who, who suggested to you or who wants to do it. We're limited in our time. Some take preparation than others.
I just echo that. I hope, I don't know why they would, but I hope even, if Dinesh sees this or if Alex sees this, we'd love to invite them to engage on all of this. None of this is out of like any sort of, I don't know. None of it's out of malice or anything. We're all pursuing the truth. We all want to know. I mean, the question of the debate is the Bible true? And as all three of us are believers in Jesus Christ, we believe that the Bible is true. But there's a nuanced discussion that takes place. So we're going to jump into this. We're not going to cover the whole breadth of the debate. There are certain aspects of the debate where they go back and forth. We're not even going to look at their opening statements. We're going to look at some specific back and forths, specifically concerning the New Testament and the Gospels, because that seems to be Alex really hammers home some of those gospel differences and what seem to be contradictions, and perhaps are contradictions, but whether or not they can be explained, and how Dinesh responds. I remember watching it and thinking, oh man, I wish Mike was there to respond to that. That would have been so fruitful. So that's what we're going to do today. I'm super excited to do this. And again, you don't even have to come on this channel. Obviously, we're not a large channel. But if Dinesh or Alex sees this, we'd encourage you set up something with Mike, us, someone. Let's continue this conversation. Yeah. All right. So this first clip is it's after they both have two opening kind of salvos of statements, like any debate, and then they go directly into kind of a conversation back and forth. So this is kind of Alex's initial question to, is the Bible true? He's going to hammer home on the New Testament here. So we'll watch a little bit of this and then we'll get a response.
I assume you'd agree with me that the Bible is a collection of books rather than a singular text, with different authors, different intentions, and most importantly, different genres. So the first question I suppose I'd like to ask you is, do you agree, for example, that at least some biblical texts are attempts at historical biography, such as in the Gospels?
Of course. I would agree with that, but let me just qualify it this way.
Sure.
So I'm gonna pause it there. I promise we won't pause it every time. This is kind of the whole premise behind your research, right, Mike? That they are Greco-Roman biographies.
That's correct. There's been a lot of discussion over the years, and in the 1970s and 80s, you had people like Charles Talbert, David Awney, and a few others who were writing books and claiming that the Gospels were not a unique genre, as most scholars at that time thought, that they belonged to the genre of Greco-Roman biography. And one might say, well, wait a minute, why not Jewish biographies? Since Matthew and John, at least, are very Jewish gospels. So why not Jewish biographies? But as Louis Feldman and others have pointed out, for some reason, Jews did not write biographies of their sages during that period. In fact, you only have 3 written by Philo in the 1st century, and you have an autobiography by Josephus. And then, according to Feldman, a Jewish scholar, he says that there were no biographies of sages until more modern times. So why that was the case, we don't know. You have the life of Moses that followed written by Philo, that followed the conventions of Greco-Roman biographies. And then you had 2 others by him, the life of Abraham and the life of Joseph. But even though they're called lives, which was the word for biography back then, they're more like commentaries on the scriptures. So they don't even really follow what a life would be. Josephus's autobiography follows the conventions of Greco-Roman biography. You might look, if you don't like the term Greco-Roman biography, you can just say ancient biography, because really, other than those I've mentioned, the Greco-Romans, Greeks and Romans writing biography, they were the only ones writing them at that time, at least those that have survived. So we look at the Gospels, and they do follow the conventions that we find in other ancient biographies of that period, those written by Greeks and Romans. So for one, you have a focus on a main character, and that makes sense. That's why it would be a biography rather than, let's say, a history, which would deal more in more broad categories. But an ancient biography could also, if it focuses on a main character, that could also be a novel, okay, which the Gospels are not. In ancient biographies, the length was typically 10 to 25,000 words, and the Gospels fit within this. Mark at about 11,000 words and some change, and then Luke is the longest at 19,000 words and some change. And then in Greco-Roman biography, you have a touch on the main character's ancestry, and then from there it skips into the inauguration of their public life, their public career. So maybe at times some of you have thought, I know I did, why don't the Gospels talk more about Jesus's youth? I mean, you only have one story about his when he was 12 years old and in the temple. And then after that, there's nothing else until the launching of his public career. But that's because that was part of the literary conventions of writing ancient biography. And then also in ancient biography, there's a focus on the person's character. What kind of a person were they? In terms, were they a good person, a bad person? What kind of moral attributes, good moral attributes did they have that should be imitated, or bad attributes, character flaws that should be eschewed, things like that? That's what the focus was on. And when you read the Gospels in view of their biographical genre, wow, a whole lot comes into focus that you don't necessarily see if you're just thinking of them as a unique genre. So yes, they are ancient biographies. Now, there is some debate about, let's say, especially Luke. Some will say, no, Luke is history. It's a history, and it's volume 1 of a history. The book of Acts is volume 2. And most people would agree that Luke's gospel is volume 1, Acts is volume 2. And they will also agree, scholars will also agree, that the Gospel of Luke contains some elements that you find in historical histories. But that doesn't mean it's not a biography. It still has the focus on the main character. It's still within the same length of a typical biography. It still gives things, deeds and sayings that illuminate who he was. It just touches on his ancestry through a genealogy and then launches into his public career. And I'd also point out just one further thing here is that in Plutarch's Life of Julius Caesar, it also has a lot of qualities of being a history, but it looks more like a biography. And that's why nobody disputes that it's a biography. So with most scholars, I agree that the Gospels are ancient biographies of Jesus.
And it's important to know that, because this is an issue of hermeneutics. If it is that genre, and we're and there are specific, I think you've referred to them as compositional devices. If we're not aware of these things when we're reading them, then there's some things that we're just going to miss. I like how you've explained it before. If we read ancient texts through modern lenses, we're the ones who are going to make mistakes. But if we read the ancient texts and put on some ancient lenses, then we're going to see things quite clearly. Would you add anything to that?
No. I think that's correct. We see this with Christology in the Gospel of Mark, which should clarify and dispel of any myth or misunderstanding that Mark does not present Jesus as God's uniquely divine son. It's crystal clear that he is deity once you see the biographical character quality conventions in which Mark writes.
Well, and that's great to know, because I mean, people like to say that, oh, we don't start seeing Jesus becoming God until John.
Yeah.
But you're saying no, put on these ancient lenses and you're going to see that Mark is saying this way before
And
John did.
that's actually
Absolutely.
something, I don't remember if Alex says it in this debate or if he said it
I
in his
think
response
I
to
think he
Wes
refers
Huff. I
to
can't
it.
remember.
Yeah.
But he does refer to the fact often that in Mark, Jesus doesn't claim to be God. And I think that's demonstrably untrue because of the things that you said. So I want to look quickly at Dinesh's response here, because this is the first moment in the debate where I was like, oh man, I feel like Alex left a door wide open with that very question of, are these biographies? I know where Mike would take this. And it would, I mean, Mike, if he had asked you that question at the beginning of the cross-examination of the debate, you would have been excited, right?
Yeah.
Like you'd have been like, yes, thank you. So let's look quickly at how Dinesh responds.
When we think of the Bible as revealed, the question now becomes, what do we mean? Did God write the book? Did God inspire the book and human beings wrote it? Did God show human beings events that they then described in their own words? Okay, so the reason these things are important is, it seems to me, to answer the question I raised earlier about in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, the way I understand it is there's a perfect revelation shown to a gospel, to a Bible, to a Jewish scribe who sees it, so to speak, but writes it in his own words. When I look at the book of Revelation, same thing.
And does it get anything wrong? Do those scribes get anything wrong?
It's quite possible that they, when you say get anything wrong, they are writing it in human terms. I mean, you know.
Well, I mean the specifically mundane human things. I'm not talking about when the author of Genesis says that God created the heavens and the earth, or talks about the Spirit moving across the face of the water. This is clearly mythological. This is clearly an attempt at mythological writing. That's fine. It would be silly to ask if that's true or not. But when somebody...
I don't think it is mythological writing at all. I think that it is simply, I mean, put it this way. If we were in the year 4000 BC, if we were John the Divine, and let's just say that God showed us in a vision the actual end of the world, right? Sure. Apocalypse. We would then write down the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, death and famine and destruction.
Okay, I'm gonna stop it there. And the reason I wanted to look at a lot of that is, remember the initial question that Alex asked was, are the Gospels ancient biography? And for some reason, Dinesh swivels to, well, think of John in Revelation seeing things and then trying to write them down. First of all, it doesn't answer the question. And second of all, that's a completely different type of writing, right? It's nothing close to what Alex is asking.
Yeah, that's correct. I don't know why Dinesh went off on that. I guess he just wasn't prepared for that question. But yeah, it seemed like he wanted to talk about the matter of inspiration rather than were the Gospels biographies. So yeah, it was a little disappointing.
Yeah, and even if it's inspiration, to leap right away into apocalyptic literature, which is a hotly debated and contested field of study in hermeneutics, to me feels like opening a door that you don't need to open in a debate. I don't know. What do you think, Tim?
What hit me, I mean, didn't I think they were talking about the creation account, and Alex O'Connor mentioned that it was clearly mythological, and then Dinesh said, no, that's not mythological at all. Well, William Lane Craig would have something to say about that too. He says, yeah, it's mytho-history. And a lot of people hear mytho and think that means false, but they miss the history part of it. So it's the term, whether we like the term or not, it's referred to as mytho-history. That is confusing to a lot of people because they can't get past the term mytho because they just assume that means fiction, but that's not the case. So it is. Dr. Craig believes it's a historical account written in the language of mythology, and once you understand that, it's the same thing that you do, Mike. You put on the ancient lenses to read ancient literature. So that was just the thing that popped out to me. I don't know if I answered your question there, Josh, but
I'd like to throw in one other thing here. As one who has been engaged in a number of debates, when your interlocutor is speaking, thoughts are racing through your head a mile a minute. Yeah. Tim, you know this since you've been involved in debates. So your mind is racing. You got 1,000 thoughts coming to you at the same time. You're trying to think about, what is this person really asking? Where are they going with this? Why are they asking this? Is there a bigger matter that they have in mind? And maybe Dinesh, while these thoughts are just going a mile a minute in his head, he's thinking that Alex wants to talk about inspiration, or that's the bigger issue here. And that's why he goes to that, because remember, he's saying, did God inspire the writers? Did he give the thoughts to the writers? It's like, and I thought, I interpreted him as thinking, how are things inspired? What do we actually have here? So maybe that's why he went that way. But Josh, you're absolutely correct. He did not answer Alex's question.
Yeah, and part of the problem is the broadness of the thing being debated, right? Is the Bible true? Like, that's a broad spectrum. So, they're jumping into the Gospels, and all of a sudden we're in the Genesis account, and then all of a sudden we're in Revelation. We're covering the gambit here. I would have liked a more focused question, like, are the Gospel accounts true? Like that, okay. Or is inspiration of Scripture, can we trust people who believe in inspiration, or something like that?
Mike,
it seems so broad.
Yeah, and I think I've heard you answer this in one sentence before, Mike. How would you answer that? Is the Bible true?
That is really a loaded question. There's a number of ways you can go with that. I'd say, well, first of all, let's define what you mean by truth. Are we looking, when Jesus tells a parable, is that in what in what sense is a parable true? Is it historically true? How do you answer that? We'd have to answer this in terms of different genres. And like you were saying, when it comes to the Genesis, the first 11 chapters in Genesis, there are numerous ways of approaching that in genre. Is it mytho-history, as William Lane Craig has said? Even J.I. Packer, who was a stalwart conservative and one of the guys who crafted the Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy, looked at a lot of what is reported in the creation account as being symbolic, quasi-liturgical celebration of the fact of creation, he says, rather than what we would have seen had we been hovering above the chaos of the events of creation. So, the first 11 chapters in Genesis, and then what do you do with the historical books of the Old Testament, such as Joshua, Judges, Kings, Samuel, and Chronicles? It seems like the chronicler is approaching things a little bit differently historically than Samuel and Kings is doing. And then you've got wisdom literature, there. So you have all these other questions that come into, is the Bible true, that you have to deal with. You just can't say yes or no. There's a lot of qualifications there.
One time you and I were having a conversation. I remember here you were in Nebraska, and we were discussing this. And correct me if I got this wrong, and I know that you've had a lot to say about how we describe and discuss inerrancy since then. But it stuck with me. I wrote it down, and I believe you said something like, well, the Bible is inerrant in all that it teaches. So then the question is raised, well, what is it actually teaching? And that's why hermeneutics is so important. That's why you got to get to the original genre, the compositional devices, and know what they were saying to that culture at the time. So many other factors that you have to take into account. So what is it actually teaching? So then the debate, then you can have debates between two people who have radically different views, who are both committed to the idea that the Bible is the inspired word of God. But then you're like, you'll have Ken Ham saying one thing about Genesis and William Lane Craig saying something else about Genesis, and it's going to come down to an issue of hermeneutics.
Mm-hmm.
Did I get you right,
Yeah.
Mike?
Yeah, you're correct on that.
Yeah. Well, one last thing before we get into, I think, the kind of some of the specific objections that Alex has, is that like, I think even if you were to ask someone like Jordan Peterson, who I don't think we would consider to be an evangelical Christian, if you were to ask him, is the Bible true? I think I've heard him say something to the effect of, well, yeah, it is true, but what do you mean by that? That sort of thing. And he goes into kind of the Jungian archetypal. It's true because of its archetypal picture of human nature, and well, that's a different type of true than even what you're talking about too, Mike. So I think it's such a broad question to just, that's the question you're debating, and I think that's part of the reason the debate was so clunky, because you're just jumping all over the place to try to answer this question. All right, let's go to the next clip here. Alex is going to ask a very specific question. This is where we're going to get into, Mike, your specific area of expertise as far as the Gospels go. I hope I have it queued up to the right spot.
This is his like a human attempt to describe a nuclear reaction?
Yes, because when words and images fail, metaphor is the actual conduit to truth.
Now, I'd understand if that were the case, if you said that perhaps after a nuclear blast, somebody describes it as, the gods of fire descending upon man with their flaming swords or something like that. But like a prostitute?
I think I queued it up to a minute too late. So let me fast forward a little bit here. Okay, I think this is the spot.
Able to render to me in words, however lengthy and ornate, what a mushroom actually tastes.
That may be true, but I was asking, for example, about Jesus's presentation at the Temple of Jerusalem after his birth. This is not like trying to describe a mushroom or the end of the world.
No. Okay, so now let's talk about that.
Hold on a second. This is a historical event that's being recorded by one New Testament writer at the same time as another New Testament writer says that the family had traveled to Egypt. I don't think this is an attempt at metaphor or allegory, as I would say of Genesis. Whether you think that is or not, I would say that in the case of the Gospels, we can agree that on at least some instances, this is a clear attempt at mundane history. This is not an attempt at writing some kind of metaphor to explain a truth that's otherwise unknowable to the human mind. It's a very straightforward attempt to record what actually happened, and they contradict each other.
They contradict each other because they're written by 4 different people.
Sure. So one of them is wrong.
Let me ask you this: if God were
okay, so let's stop it there. So specifically, the question of, hey, the Gospels contradict each other because they're written by 4 different people. You've covered that in your book that I have on my shelf down here, but specifically the presented at the temple, the circumcision, or the flight to Egypt. How do those factor into these contradictions?
Well, this is a difficult one. I think this is, of all the differences in the Gospels, this is one of the most difficult one. In fact, it may be the most difficult one. So Alex made a good choice here. So what you have is in Matthew, you have they're in Bethlehem, and the angel tells Joseph, warns him of Herod trying to kill the baby, and so tells him to get up and flee to Egypt. And so they go, and then they're there. Most think it may be about 2 years, and then Herod the Great dies, and so the angel says it's safe to go back to Judea, or to Israel. And so Joseph picks up his family, Mary and Jesus, and says, "Let's go back." And so they head back. Well, then they get into Israel, and they learn that Herod's son Archelaus is the one in that region that they were looking at. And Archelaus was brutal. He later got deposed by Augustus, taken out of his position because he was just unwise and brutal, and people were complaining about him. So Augustus removed him. But while he was there, Joseph feared him, and so the angel said, "Well, yeah, just go settle, and don't go there." And they end up going to Nazareth. So remember, they're taking off from Bethlehem and fleeing to Egypt. But when you look at Luke's account, they're in Bethlehem. And then when the days of purification were over, which is 40 days, then they go into Jerusalem to the temple. And there it is that Jesus is dedicated he's dedicated. And then they leave there and go to Nazareth. So it's like, well, that's not compatible with the timeline that we see in Matthew. So it's a difficult one. If I had to guess, I wouldn't harmonize this, but if I had to guess what's going on, I would say that Jesus was probably dedicated in the temple 40 days after his birth. Then they went back to Bethlehem, maybe because the census hadn't registered yet or whatever. And that's only about 30 miles. So, I mean, you could cover that in not a lot of time. It's not a long trip between Bethlehem to Jerusalem. So, they probably give birth maybe immediately once they get in Bethlehem. 40 days later, they go to Jerusalem, and then they go back to Bethlehem. And it's from there that Joseph gets warned by the angel to go to Egypt. And so they go, and they're already 30 miles in that direction. And I think to cross the Egyptian border was probably another 100 miles around that. So, and we don't know where they were in Egypt, but to cross over to Egypt, about another 100 miles. So I would guess that happened. And then I would just think that maybe Luke wasn't concerned. He wasn't interested in the flight to Egypt in that time there. So he just skips that and goes to, has them settle in Nazareth. That'd be my guess of what's going on. So I don't think the counts are easily harmonized. I think just some are focused on more events than others. That would be my guess, but it is a difficult one.
Yeah. So, and then you also have the issue of like when the wise men get there and all those sorts of things that kind of play alongside of the birth story. But it seems explainable. Now, not if you just match up the timelines, because correct me if I'm wrong, it doesn't, the beginning of the birth stories and when they go to Egypt in Matthew, there's not really a timeline given, just kind of a and then, right?
That's
it's
correct.
Not like 40 days later they went to Egypt. It's just it acts as if that's the next thing that happened, but that's not necessarily the next thing that happened.
Right.
Am I off there, or is that?
No, I think you're right. I don't see much of a timeline there in Bethlehem, so it's not a stretch. I don't think it would be a stretch to say that they went from Bethlehem to Jerusalem and then back to Bethlehem before the flight to Egypt.
Yeah. So in this one, and then Dinesh will say, "Well, you're picking on a little thing that nobody's ever heard about." So let's go here. I don't know if this is where he says that, but he kind of says that, and then he it seems like he lets his frustration get the best of him because he wants to talk about something else. But let's continue.
Approaching it as modern historians. Luke is going around interviewing people.
So let me ask this very, very straightforwardly then.
Okay.
Luke says that after the birth of Jesus, the family fled to Egypt. Matthew says that they went to the Jerusalem temple. Are they both correct, or is one of them wrong?
Who the heck cares? I mean, look.
Well, I do, and so
well,
do
you
probably
do,
the
but
people who are listening to a debate about whether the Bible is true.
Let me say why what you care about is not only trivial, but indicates a kind of unwillingness to try to get what the text is trying to communicate.
I'll tell you why I don't think it's trivial. Because I think that the reason why Luke may have invented the flight to Egypt, but he tells us. Luke says, when he records the flight to Egypt, and then they return from Egypt, he says, this is so that we can fulfill the prophecy from Hosea chapter 11, out of Egypt I shall call my son. Now, in Hosea, God is talking here about the nation of Israel. At least in this case, unlike the Matthew prophecy, the prophecy actually exists and we can interrogate it. It seems
Okay, let's pause it there. I think maybe Alex misspoke, because Luke is not the one that says, "Out of Egypt I
Right.
call my son." It's Matthew, correct? So I think he just
Right.
misspoke there. I'm not gonna denigrate him at all there, but
Yeah,
so
we all
his
make those
assumption,
kinds of mistakes. It's not a big
yeah,
deal.
yeah. So his assumption is, he says he thinks that Matthew kind of invents that to add prophecy to Jesus's to Jesus's repertoire, I guess. And then he says something else about, well, there are other prophecies in Matthew that didn't, like, basically that didn't exist. So it's kind of a two-pronged question. One is, we already talked about, like, the birth of Jesus, or trying to figure out what's going on with those two, seemingly that contradiction. But the second one is that a reasonable assumption for Alex to make, that it's Matthew inventing this so that Jesus can seem like more of the Messiah and he can pull in Hosea? And the second question, does Matthew make up prophecies that aren't found other places?
Yeah. You know, let's talk about the prophecies here for a second, because you know, this is something to get into the weeds with. It's not easy, and I think Alex is perfectly fine in bringing up this stuff, because it's not one of the easy ones. So, is he okay to throw in the prophecies of Matthew and say that they don't exist? I'd say, to an extent, yes, because the texts cited as prophecies in Matthew especially, and sometimes by Luke and sometimes by Paul, these prophecies would seem to us to be a bit of a stretch and taken out of context. They would be, as I would term it, repurposed. But I would also say that I would answer no, that how we moderns often understand prophecy is not always the same as how those in Second Temple Judaism understood it. You do have repurposing. You do have typology. And it wasn't just the Christians that did this. It was the Jews who did that in their literature. So this wasn't something unique to the Christians. Now, to us moderns, we might look at that and say, well, that's not very persuasive that Jesus was fulfilling prophecy there. I agree. For Matthew to say the flight to Egypt, and then when Jesus comes out of Egypt, I called my son, that seems to be forced. I think it's better to say that's typology. I wouldn't use it for apologetic purposes, to show that Jesus was fulfilling prophecy, that he was the Messiah. But I think it's also a bit of a stretch to say that Matthew was inventing that in order to show it was fulfilled prophecy. I don't see that occurring here. As a historian here, I find something else that is more interesting, and that is this. There are approaches to prophecy in Matthew and, let's say, in Acts, that I find of great interest. So let's just take that out of Egypt. I called my son. That's from Hosea chapter 11, verse 1. And that is clearly in the context there. If you look at verse 10, I think it is, maybe it's even the beginning of verse 11, it's referring to Israel. And God is, Hosea there is referring to when God delivered the Jews out of Egypt. He called them out of Egypt. And so he said, out of Egypt, I called my son. He is referring to calling the Israelites out of Egypt and freeing them from their bondage there. And Matthew is applying this to Jesus. Now, if a pastor did this on a Sunday morning in their sermon, and did it on a regular basis, we would put them on a forced sabbatical and require them to take a course in hermeneutics. But the biblical writers on some occasions do this. We see Matthew doing it probably more than the others. And I think he is just thinking typology here. But why I like this, one thing I see about it is, if Jesus went down to Egypt, what Matthew is trying to do is figure out what is going on here. why would the Messiah have to flee? He's the Messiah. He's going to be powerful. Why would he have to cowardly flee to Egypt for a while? And so he comes up with this prophecy. He searches the scriptures and he finds Hosea 11. He says, hey, I can use this as typology here and kind of make it make sense. But to me, that suggests that they went to Egypt, and Matthew's trying to make sense of that.
Wow.
So I see this also in reference to the resurrection in the book of Acts. So here in chapter 2, you have Peter and Paul in chapter 13. They are using Psalm 16:10, which says, now this is a Psalm of David, and David's life is being pursued, and he's confident that God is going to deliver him. And so he says, you will not allow your Holy One to see decay. So David, by that, is saying he's confident that God is going to rescue him. He's not going to allow David, his Holy One, to be killed and his body decay. Well, what you have is Peter in Acts chapter 2 and Paul in Acts chapter 13. They're applying that. They're repurposing that to apply to Jesus. And in fact, Paul says in chapter 13, this couldn't apply to David because David died, was buried, his body did decay. We know where his grave is. But Jesus died, was buried, his body did not decay. God raised him up, and of that we're eyewitnesses. And then you have Psalm 2, verse 7. Now, this is a coronation hymn for the Israelite king. And the psalmist says here, you are my son, today I have begotten you. In other words, it is God saying to the new king who's being coronated that day, you have now become my son. I have begotten you. I've given birth to you. I have adopted you as my son today. That's in Acts chapter 13. Paul quotes it. Well, what Paul is using this, he's repurposing it, and he's basically saying by the resurrection of Jesus, because Jesus is God's son, he has begotten him at the resurrection. In other words, he has given him life by raising him from the dead. So he repurposes Psalm 2 in order to refer to the resurrection of Jesus. And in fact, the author of Hebrews uses that same verse and repurposes it for an entirely different meaning. So I think what we have here is Paul and Peter on these two occasions when they're preaching in the book of Acts, the apostles, and you say Jesus, 1 Corinthians 15, he died, was buried, and he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures. You got to say, well, what scriptures? And I think one thing they did was they went back to the scriptures because they weren't expecting a dying and rising Messiah that just threw them for surprise. They weren't expecting it. And so they're trying to make sense of this, how the Messiah that they thought would triumph over the Romans when he came and free them from their bondage, how it is that he could be executed by the Romans and then rise from the dead ahead of the general resurrection. And so they search the scriptures and they see these verses in Psalms, and they say, okay, well, we're trying to make sense of this. And these are the verses in scripture that we find. And so as a historian, that seems to me to suggest even more that it gives me another reason to think that the resurrection of Jesus actually occurred, and they're trying to make sense of it. And this is the best they could come up with.
Wow. Interesting.
Yeah, that's good. And one thing theologically to that, not only is it the best that they can come up with, in my opinion, it's also something that is going to be at least plausible to the Jewish people, as they explain it to them. It's not like this completely new way of reading scripture. They're actually able to convince other Jewish people that these are the way these scriptures can be used this way. So it doesn't feel like they invented it either. They're using a tradition to explain what is happening with Jesus. And for part of the reason we can't do that today is because we don't have that same sort of tradition like that they would have had to pull from to be able to do that. We can't just decide to take a passage of scripture and apply it to Tim because it seems to fit his character. That's not in part of our tradition of how we extrapolate and analyze the text. It would have been in theirs. So I just kind of throwing that out there as well. Tim, do you have anything to add before we move on?
I just wanted to ask a clarifying question. Can you define for us, Mike, what typology is?
That's good.
Yeah, it'd be like Jesus is like Matthew presents Jesus as a type of Moses. So I think one of the changes that Matthew makes, it's a slight change, but you have the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, whereas in Luke, it's the Sermon on the Plain. It's two different locations where he delivers this. Now, I'm convinced that it wasn't on top the mount, as Matthew seems to suggest. Tim, you and I were in Israel a few years ago, and we went to the place that is known as the traditional location of the Sermon on the Mount, and I recited it from there.
Oh, it's great.
And you could hear it within our small group of people, but someone that was maybe 100 yards away would not have heard it because of the acoustics. And the first time I was in Israel, we did it at another place on top of a hill that's close to the traditional site. And there was a slight wind blowing. I recited it. In fact, it was recorded. It's on my YouTube channel. It only takes about 16 minutes. But even people who were maybe 15 feet away from me weren't able to hear me that well when I turned in the opposite direction and the wind was blowing. So it was horrible acoustics at the top. But if he's on the plain and everybody's sitting on a hill in a type of maybe the hill is in such a sense as amphitheater where they could sit there, well, the acoustics could be quite good, and you could have hundreds, perhaps even thousands of people who could have heard him like that. But why would Matthew change the location of the Sermon on the Mount from the plain to on top of the mount? And it's been suggested that as Moses received God's law from the top of the mountain, Jesus is interpreting God's law at the top of the mountain. So he's a type of new Moses. That makes really good sense to me. So Matthew makes a slight change for theological, just a theological symbolism that he wants to communicate through there. And he does this, Matthew does this in his genealogy as well. He arranges his genealogy in an artistic manner in order to communicate that Jesus is the Messiah.
Cool.
Good.
So typology references
typology. He's a type of Moses.
Type of Moses.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you.
All right. Here's the next clip.
Have a Jewish literalist reading and a Christian metaphorical reading.
Yeah.
Another example, and
So would you say then the flight to Egypt is a metaphor? Is that what you're trying to say? In other words, I'm trying to understand what it is that you're doing here to actually answer the question that I'm asking you, which is about, because here's my theory, here's an idea.
Okay.
Luke, the author of Luke, invents the flight to Egypt in order to identify Jesus as the Jewish Messiah, meaning that when we read Luke, we should note that where it appears that he's making historical claims, we should note his willingness to twist history in order to fulfill a theological
you don't know
aim.
if he's doing that. You're assuming that. This is your theory.
No. What I'm saying is that that's one thesis to explain the contradiction between Luke and Matthew. If you want to say that it's trivial, then fine, but we still have to explain how it comes about. And what I'm saying is one idea of how this comes about leads to us undermining our trustworthiness of Luke. What I'm asking you for is your explanation that would not lead to us having to undermine the trustworthiness of Luke.
I don't have the ability to referee that passage. I'm not aware of this contradiction. I'll have to go back and look and see.
That's fine.
Go and look.
Okay, so I actually enjoyed Dinesh saying, I'm actually not like almost like the reason I'm kind of avoiding this is because I actually don't know what to do with it. But he's saying it doesn't undermine in his mind, it doesn't undermine Matthew. It doesn't undermine Luke. If you heard Alex's assessment of what he thinks is going on there, which to me, I asked the people watching this, which seems more plausible, the way Mike explained it after we talked about it, or kind of the nefarious intent to undermine it, that and of course I'm kind of poisoning the well there when I say that, but Mike, when you hear Alex's theory, we can replay it again if you want. How does that strike you? Do you feel like that's really undermining, or do you feel like we've already covered why it wouldn't be?
I think, Josh, I think it's a bit of a stretch. And when I have to admit that, these things are, you can only go so far as a historian in being able to adjudicate on some of these things. I suppose that 1,000 years from now, someone could say that the 9/11 and the events that happened on September 11, 2001 never really occurred, and then engage in modern mythologizing. And it'd be pretty easy to do that. You could say videos can be certainly forged and fabricated. And certainly AI by then will be just amazing. But they'll say, well, they didn't have AI back then. Yeah, but you had Steven Spielberg, he could have done some things like that. And, there was a plane that took off early one morning from Massachusetts, and just after 10 a.m., it flew into one of the tallest skyscrapers in New York City between the 78th and 80th floors, killing everyone on board. And I'm referring actually to the B-25 that flew into the Empire State Building on July 28th, 1945. That actually happened. But when I'm describing that, a lot of people might think, well, you were referring to the 767 that flew into the South Tower on 9/11. But I wasn't. It was the same floors pretty much that happened on 9/11 in the South Tower. Same state it took off of, same city it flew into, skyscraper, one of the tallest in the world, same floors, the same hour of the day. I mean, it's just amazing. And then you could say further show that this was just symbolic was, back then, who did you call when you had an emergency? 911, 9/11. Well, what was the emergency? Well, the U.S. was going through the greatest recession in its history at that point. And so therefore, the collapse of the Twin Towers was there as symbolic of the economic crisis that was going on in the country. The plane that flew into the Pentagon was symbolic of the declining U.S. influence around the world. The plane that flew into the Pennsylvania farm field showed that all of this impacted the average American. So you can modern mythologize and make up this kind of stuff. And, I do think that you have some degree of some of the symbolic stuff, like I mentioned with the typology of the location of the Sermon on the Mount, maybe the change of the day on which Jesus was crucified, some things like this in John. But I don't see those are just very minor changes. You're talking about a huge change here in Matthew's gospel with the flight to Egypt, just to get a forced prophecy out of Egypt, I called my son, which others back then, they wouldn't have found that very persuasive. I think my approach to it, well, at least it's more persuasive to me.
Yeah. I would hope so. And it is to me as well. But I felt like, there's a little bit of frustration because Alex wants to get a response. And finally, Dinesh is like, look, I actually don't know what to do with that. And then that kind of opens up the door for Alex to say, well, here's a theory, and then it's never rebutted. And that's kind of like, to me, it's one of those things where it goes, you can actually hold the right position on something that you're debating and lose the debate.
Right.
And to me, like in that moment, people in the audience could be like, well, you know what? That does undermine the Gospels or the stories if they don't have somebody's response like you just gave. Tim, you have anything to add before we move to the next thing?
Well said.
All right. So here's the next thing. Alex is going to ask a question here of Dinesh, and then he's going to list off, we'll skip after this to like the 1 hour mark, and he's going to list off 5 examples of contradictions, and we're going to we're going to have kind of a rapid fire with Mike. So
Right.
let's do this one first.
New Testament is an entirely theological and in no way a historical text. Would you agree at least that the New Testament writers are seemingly willing to adapt the historicity of an event in order to serve a theological point? Would you agree with that?
Yes and no. I would agree that.
Well,
I
that
mean,
definitely is a contradiction.
Well, it's not a contradiction because, well, I mean, Thucydides is relaying historical events to make a moral point about the nature of politics, and both are completely consistent with each other.
Sure.
It's not as if Thucydides is, so he's a student of power politics. He is making a point. His speeches are driven at making a point, but the point is excavated out of the actual events. Now, I think that there's a reason that we're given 4 perspectival accounts of Jesus's life. And they're not identical. In fact, as I say, if they were identical, you wouldn't need 4. The point of reading these, and I think the way to read them. Let me say a word. If you want to determine veracity, you have to operate a little bit like a jury, and by that I mean, pick up the Gospel of Mark, the first of the Gospels. Now, by the way, these Gospels are written very proximate to the events they describe. And I say this by the standards of, we're talking about historicity of any historical document.
Okay, let's stop it there. So there was a lot there. So the first thing that Alex does is says, are you willing to cede the point that they will sacrifice historicity for theological points, right? And then Dinesh says, well, yes and no. Alex says that's a contradiction. And then he goes into Thucydides. I don't know if I said the name right.
Thucydides.
Thucydides. There we go. Did you find that to be a salient point, Mike? Where would you have gone as an example?
I would have pointed out that I would agree that sometimes they could manipulate a little bit some of the details in order to make a theological point. I think of a fabricated scene in Plutarch's life of, maybe it was his life of Brutus or his life of Antony. I don't remember which, but the conspirators are planning for the assassination of Caesar, and they want to see if they can get Antony on board. So what they do is a guy named Trebonius, he wants to meet with Antony. And there was a time when Caesar was out of town, and then he's coming back, and a bunch of people went out to meet him, a couple days journey outside of the city of Rome to meet him, to welcome him back, which was standard to do for the emperor at that time. Or let's see, was he emperor? I don't know. He might have been emperor then, but certainly he was the consul. He was a dictator at that point. So what Plutarch knew, that Trebonius had a conversation with Antony at some point to see if he would want to participate in it. And Antony, probably the result was Antony didn't want to participate, but he wouldn't stop it. But Plutarch did not know when and where that conversation took place. And so he invented a scene that had Trebonius and Antony go out to meet Caesar as he was returning and share a tent. Now, Christopher Pelling, I'm not a classicist, so I don't have all the reasons for this, but Christopher Pelling, who is the foremost Plutarch scholar today, he says that meeting where they shared a tent and discussed it at that time, that would not have happened historically. But, and I don't know why I can't answer that. I can just say that that's what Pelling says. But he contends that Plutarch invented that scene. This discussion took place, don't know where. So rather than saying that this discussion took place, but I don't know when it happened or where it happened, no, as Lucian and Quintilian talk about, the responsibility of the historian is to make a smooth narrative. And so Plutarch invents the scene for that and places it at the scene where the discussion took place. I do think that you've got the evangelists, the gospel authors, that at times will bend the details a little bit in order to make a theological point. We talked about this. I mentioned it with the location of the feeding of the 5,000. I'm sorry, of the Sermon on the Mount. I mentioned how I think Matthew does this with his genealogy. I do think I agree with Craig Keener that John changed the day and time of Jesus's crucifixion just by a few hours in order to make the theological point that Jesus is our Passover lamb and the burnt offering for our sins. So even Paul refers to Jesus as our Passover lamb. So this was just a neat way that John could illustrate such a thing in his gospel. So yeah, I do think that this happens. So does it change the essence of the story? Not at all. But they bend a little bit of the details. But as one final thing I'll say is that Plutarch says this in his Life of Alexander the Great, chapter 1. Pelling says it is the most quoted of all of Plutarch's, the literature that Plutarch wrote. And Plutarch basically says in that text that you'll have to excuse him. He says, excuse me if I don't mention all of the great events that this person was involved in, like where thousands fall in battle. Because he says, I'm not writing a history, I'm writing a life, a biography. And so I'm only, just as a artist, when he paints a portrait, he's going to focus on the face and especially the eyes to communicate who this person is. Are they kind? Are they evil? Are they strict? Are they lenient? Things like this. So will I focus on the deeds and things this person said, the events in their life that illuminate their character. And so that's what we find the gospel authors doing on occasion with Jesus.
And in your mind, obviously, since you wrote the book, that does not undermine the authenticity of Jesus' life, of Jesus' words, of his death and resurrection.
That's correct. I like to think of it, Plutarch used the word portrait there. Now, of course, they didn't have photographs back then. But in a portrait, of course, and we know this up until maybe even the present day, but certainly in the Renaissance period, and even up to just a few hundred years ago, when a portrait was painted, you would do certain things in order to communicate things. Like if they had their hand on their hip, that was to create an air of authority. You see a modern portrait of George Washington. He's got his hand on his hip. He's in his military uniform, and you see a battle going on in the distance. Well, certainly he wasn't there posing for that portrait while this battle was going on and a cannonball is headed his way, incoming. No, that was to tell us about George Washington. He had that air of, and he had that authority as a general, and he commanded troops in battle. So you had these kinds of things going on. So no, the battle didn't take place while he was posing for this, but it communicates about George Washington. Now, of course, you can have photographs, and that's going to tell us exactly what was going on at that time, as long as it's not edited. Sometimes, like one illustration I'll give is maybe a photographer takes a photograph of a couple on a sunny day walking through a meadow, holding hands, and it's a pretty romantic scene. And so what you're looking at the raw photo and you say, well, that's kind of neat. I'm happy for that couple. But maybe what the photographer does is does a little bit of editing, makes the grass a little greener, makes the sky a little bluer, puts a little bit of a haze in there, and whoa, the romantic element of that moment really comes out. You can almost feel the butterflies in your own stomach. So these slight adaptations can be done to a photograph in order to raise up and accentuate certain elements that are taking place that may not be so apparent in the raw, untouched photograph. I think that this is what's going on in ancient biography on many, with the better biographers of what's going on. manipulating some of the data in order to accentuate some things that may not be so clear to the readers. Are the things that they are drawing attention to true? Yes, they believe these things are true. And I think there'd be reason to believe these things are true. But they may not be true in a precise sense of being exactly what we would have seen had we been there.
So it's like when we're taking pictures with our phones and we could put the filters on.
That's right.
Like, hey, no filter. But just because there is a filter on it, it doesn't mean that it's not a photo of an actual event, even if it doesn't look exactly as it really did. It's still right. It's still true in an important sense.
Yeah.
Yes.
And some people might say you can manipulate a photo so much that it would not have the ring of authenticity.
It's true.
So, and clearly we see that you can do that in these, I don't know, ancient writings, biographies, with some of the false gospels that don't make it into the canon, because they say things like they rowed a boat up to Nazareth, and it's actually just land, and no one would actually use a boat to go up to Nazareth, because they go so outlandish, because they apply too many filters. It distorts reality that then that is a false depiction of the events. Is that kind of fair to say? How a historian would analyze some of these things?
Yeah. The better biographers would only go so far. So if you're a poor biographer, maybe you're inventing a lot of things that just go way beyond what the good biographers would do. I'm convinced that with the Gospels, you've got an essentially faithful representation of those things. Now, John, I don't know what to say with John, and a lot of scholars don't know what to say about John. They still think it's biography, but John takes some liberties, extra liberties, that I don't think the Synoptic Gospels do.
John is the Jordan Peterson of the gospel writers.
Yeah.
All right, let's go to the next clip here.
This is a commonly presented argument for the historicity of the resurrection, which, by the way, now we're talking as
well. I'm not. No, hold on. I didn't say it's an argument for the historicity of the resurrection. I said it was an argument.
Let me say a word.
Okay.
Now we're talking about these texts if they are historical texts. The thing about the women is, look, this is quite straightforward to me. Who anoints bodies? Who goes to tombs and anoints bodies after someone dies? It's not men, it's women. And so if the authors of the Gospels had the men go to the tomb to anoint the body, which is what Mary and the other women were doing when they went to the tomb, that itself would be very strange and give us reason to doubt the historicity of the events. In other words, it's like if there's a task that women do, and that task is how Jesus's empty tomb is discovered, then why would he invent it? Why would they invent a story that has men going and doing it? Secondly, you said that you need multiple women's testimony. How many women go to the tomb? Multiple. Thirdly, what do the women do immediately after seeing the empty tomb? They run and tell the men who come and verify it for us. Right. So I don't think that this is this fulfills the criterion of embarrassment at all. In fact, I think the opposite is true. I think that if this was an invented story, I'm not saying it is, by the way, but if it were, then of course we could expect the people who discover the empty tomb to be women, because it's women who go to anoint the body at the tomb.
Okay.
So that's Alex's claim about the body. So that's kind of the criterion of embarrassment, is you wouldn't have women finding the empty tomb because they're not reliable witnesses, that sort of thing. He presents a different way of looking at this to say, well, if the women aren't the ones finding the tomb of Jesus, then then everyone would have doubted its historicity, because men weren't the ones that went and anointed the bodies. What do you have to say about just the way he presented that, whether or not that's something that is accurate?
I think Alex may be missing the point that's being made here about the criterion of embarrassment. If you're going to invent the story of an empty tomb, if the empty tomb wasn't there, if Jesus had just been thrown into a common burial spot and was not given a proper burial, and they're inventing the story of the empty tomb. Well, they would just have the women anoint the body during his Friday burial, and have the men go to the tomb on Sunday morning and discover it empty. You don't have to create such a problem by having the women going there and they receiving the revelation from the angel that Jesus had been raised from the dead. So it's interesting to note, Gary Habermas is the foremost authority on the resurrection of Jesus. As you're well aware, two volumes of his magnum opus are out now, each of which average about 1,000 pages. And he's got 2 more coming out this year. So as I said in my blurb that I wrote for the book, there's only one person who knows more about the resurrection of Jesus than Gary Habermas, and that's Jesus. And so over the years, he has been looking at where scholars are on more than 100 issues related to the resurrection. And when he comes to the empty tomb, he says that the majority of critical New Testament scholars today do think, I think it's 80% now, 80 or 85%. It's gone up since Gary and I wrote the case for the resurrection of Jesus. But the primary argument that's given for that is the embarrassing testimony of women. If you're going to invent this account, why would you make the women the primary witnesses to the empty tomb and the revelation of the angelic proclamation that Jesus had been raised? Why would you make it women whom no one's going to believe? And in fact, what's interesting in Luke's gospel, when they come back and report the empty tomb and that they saw angels, Luke reports that the men thought they were telling frivolous tales. And Celsus jumps on this. Celsus, the critic of Christianity in the 2nd century, he even goes to it and he says, and who are the ones reporting the first to report the resurrection? Frantic women. So he understood that this was problematic from the viewpoint of writing this as history. So I do think that Alex is missing the point here. If they're inventing it, they would have just made it at a point where the men could have been the first to witness the empty tomb, gotten the revelation from the angel that Jesus had been raised from the dead. They would have just had the women anoint the body of Jesus, take a few minutes and do that on Friday when he was buried.
So isn't there a gospel, an ancient gospel account that tries to rectify they have some of the disciples and people sleeping by the tomb, and they're the ones that find it's like a counterfeit gospel. I can't remember which one it was.
There's something called that's called the Gospel of Peter. It's not trying to reconcile all these things and who went first and all that, but it's on the first day of a week, and it says, and this was written probably sometime in the latter half of the 2nd century. We know it was around by the year 200, but there you've got all these people who are there by the tomb on Sunday morning, and then these 2 angels come down from heaven and they roll the stone away from the tomb. They go into the tomb and they bring out Jesus carrying him on their shoulders, and the heads of the angels go up to the clouds, and Jesus' head goes up above the clouds, and then a cross follows them out of the tomb, a walking, talking cross. And God's voice comes out of heaven and addresses the cross and says, "Did you preach to those who sleep, the dead?" And the cross says, "Yes." So what's interesting about this, you do have a cross by Jesus that accompanies him. You have it in the Ethiopic Apocalypse of Peter. You have it in the Shepherd of Hermas, and I think it's 4th Ezra. These are all 2nd century writings. And so, the Gospel of Peter, no one really looks at this as being an authentic gospel. It's pseudepigraphal. It was not allowed as Serapion, Bishop of Antioch, said around the year 200. It was not allowed to be read in public worship, falsely attributed to Peter. But we only have a fragment of it. And that fragment comes from the Akhmim Codex, which is, I think, 5th to 7th century, so dated between the 5th and 7th century, or 400 to 600 years after the Gospels were written. And it differs in some significant ways from a fragment from around the year 200 in the Oxyrhynchus papyri written in Greek, it differs from that. And I think the Gospel of Peter in the Akhmim Codex is written in Coptic. So again, we only have a fragment of it. There's not a whole lot, so we don't even know what the whole gospel would have said.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, I can't remember where I heard that, but Tim, were you gonna have something?
Yeah, just got a quick question while we were talking about the women going to anoint the body of Jesus. Why would they be going to the tomb to anoint the body if the tomb was closed and sealed?
That's a good question, and in fact, it's even one of the gospel authors says, and they were wondering, how are we going to get in? Because the stone is too heavy to roll away.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, sometimes we do things like that, right? And we say, yeah, it's a problem. I don't know how we're going to solve it.
Let's go try.
We'll get to that when we get there.
Yeah, right. Good,
yeah,
good.
Yeah, that's good. All right, now this is the part where Alex lists off, I think 5, just in rapid succession. You've referred to a few already while we've talked, but we'll address those. He lists off 5.
Okay, Dinesh, also you said, why could you only bring up this one example? Take your pick. The date of Jesus' crucifixion, whether they're to take a staff or not to take a staff, the dating of Jesus flipping the tables at the temple, Mary Magdalene and what she says at the tomb, when the temple curtain rips. In the Gospel of Luke, it says that this happens before Jesus' death. And in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark, it says that it happens afterwards. We can go through any of these contradictions that you like, but the problem is that what you're going to tell me is that it's trivial. And then when I try to explain that it's not trivial, you say, oh, well, I haven't even heard of it and no one else really cares about this, when other people do.
Okay. And I think Alex is right. Other people do care about it, and it's okay to care about it. And it's okay, too, for Dinesh to be like, yeah, but I didn't think that's what this, we're going to talk about the whole Bible, and now we're just focusing on these minute details. But he lists off 5 specific things. The date of Jesus' crucifixion, we've already referred to that. The staff or no staff. And then dating of flipping the tables, so cleansing of the temple. What Mary Magdalene says at the tomb, and then when the curtain rips. So let's do some rapid fire here. If you can't remember which is the next one, I got them written down here. I'll let you know.
I disagree with Alex here. I do think that they are fairly trivial. And these kinds of things are found in all ancient historical literature. So if Alex wants to, discredit the Gospels because of this and says it's really important, and think that they're not historically reliable as a result, he's going to have to say that about all ancient historical literature. I mean, all you have to do, take the assassination of Julius Caesar. It's reported in Appian, Cicero, Dio, Livy, Nicolaus, Plutarch, Suetonius, and Velleius. In fact, Plutarch mentions it in 4 of his biographies, 4 of his lives: the life of Cicero, life of Brutus, life of Antony, and life of Caesar. And you have even discrepancies of details, even when Plutarch, the same author writing at the same time about the same event using the same sources, is reporting some of these details differently. And especially when you look at some of these others. I mean, I list some of these in, I don't know which book it is, certainly in my first book, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? It may be in the second one, Jesus Contradicted. But these are minor things. These are very minor. And again, if you're going to discredit the Gospels, then you're going to have to discredit all ancient historical literature. And so I wonder if Alex is prepared to do that. Now, in terms of these examples he gave, whether to take a staff or not, I mean, I think this is fairly simple. Mark says, okay, don't take this, don't take this, don't take a money belt, don't take sandals, don't take this and this and this, but you can take a staff. When Matthew tells the same thing, he says, don't take this, and don't take a staff. So what's going on? I think that what Matthew has done is he has redacted Mark here. He has changed it in order to simplify it and said, look, Jesus is saying, don't take anything, because he wants to make Jesus's message to his disciples abundantly clear, which is clear in Mark, but by changing this thing, don't take a staff, don't take sandals, don't take all of this, it makes it abundantly clear they are to trust God for everything. So he makes this small move in order to make the message clearer. I don't see a problem with that. Now, if you're saying, I want to know exactly what Jesus said, word for word, well, you're just not going to get it, okay? There's things that we want, but we don't get everything we want. We're not going to get the exact words of Jesus anyway, because when he's talking to his disciples, he's most likely speaking in Aramaic. We get it in the Greek translation of that Aramaic. And then most of us are reading an English translation of the Greek. So that's not to say that we're not getting an essentially faithful representation of what Jesus said, but it is to say we're not getting his exact words. We are getting a good, essentially faithful representation of his message here. Matthew is just taking that a step further in order to communicate that message with greater clarity. The dating of flipping the tables. I think Craig Keener again here is correct. And most scholars who comment on this, though not all, but most, who say that John has relocated the cleansing of the temple and puts it as during the Passover, because that's when it was in the Synoptic Gospels. But he relocates it to the beginning of ministry so he can frame the entirety of Jesus's ministry as a Passover, and really highlight that theological point that Jesus is our Passover lamb. Now, is he correct on that? Are these scholars correct? I don't know. It makes sense to me. I think John does change the day of Jesus' crucifixion, the time on which he was crucified, in order to make a theological point as well. So what about Mary Magdalene's words at the tomb? I'm not sure what he's referring to exactly. Maybe it's they have taken the Lord and we don't know where they've laid him. Whereas it's a little bit different of what she says when she sees Jesus. When she sees Jesus in John versus what she sees Jesus in Matthew. Maybe that's what he's referring to. I have to acknowledge there are two areas in the resurrection narratives that I just don't know what's going on here. One is where Jesus first appeared to Mary Magdalene. Was it just outside of the tomb, as John has it, or was it as Mary and the other Mary are running away from the tomb and Jesus intercepts them and repeats the message that the angel had communicated to them? I don't know what's going on here. I could just take a guess, but it would be wild speculation. The other one is where Jesus appeared first to his group of male disciples. In Matthew and implied in Mark, it's in Galilee, but in Luke and John, it's in Jerusalem. Now, Luke, I think, is compressing the account, and everything happens on Easter. The resurrection, all of the appearances and the ascension happens on Easter. So he's compressing this. And we know this because in his sequel, Acts, he informs us in the first chapter that Jesus appeared to them over a period of 40 days. So Luke knew it happened over a longer period of time. He's just compressing the account to have occurred over a shorter period of time than it actually did, which was a common literary device, a compositional device. Why was he doing it? I don't know. Maybe he's running out of space on his scroll. He's got the longest gospel. Maybe he's just doing it for dramatic effect. I don't know. But I don't see a problem there with Luke. The problem is with John. He places it in Jerusalem, whereas Matthew is clear that it happens in Galilee. I explain this in both of my, or I think both of my books, at least in the first one. I show why it is very clear. Jesus tells them in Mark 14:28 that after he rises from the dead, he will go ahead of them to Galilee, and it is there that they will see him. In fact, the word there appears first in the clause and draws emphasis to it. Jesus is emphasizing there in Galilee is where they will see him. The angel repeats this in 16:7. where he says, go and tell the disciples and Peter that Jesus has gone ahead of them. He's going ahead of them to Galilee. There they will see him just as he told them. So the angel tells them they're going to see him in Jerusalem. And then he says, then Mark says the angels or the women fled. But Matthew says after the angel communicated this to the women, they communicated to the men, and the men went to Galilee as they were instructed, and Jesus appeared to them. So Matthew and Mark Matthew is very clear the first appearance occurred in Galilee. Mark certainly implies it. And then Luke and John are clear that it happens in Jerusalem. And in fact, I argue why. We can be convinced, persuaded. It seems clear to me that the appearance that Luke mentions in Luke 24 is the same appearance that Matthew mentions in Matthew 28. So one of them has relocated this initial appearance to the group of male disciples to another location. Why they did it, I have no idea. I mean, we can kind of guess, but it's just speculation. So I don't know why these things happen. Anyway, that's a long answer to Mary Magdalene's words at the tomb. And then when the curtain rips, you've got Luke says that the temple veil tore right before Jesus died, whereas Matthew has it after Jesus died. So which one was it? My guess is no one really knew, and they just narrated it where they wanted to put it there. So I think this does suggest that Luke was not reading Matthew. Matthew was not reading Luke here. I think they were familiar with Mark, as most scholars think. But yeah, I mean, this is a trivial detail. When did it rip? Before or after? You know, they are trying to write a coherent narrative that runs smoothly. That's what they're concerned about. And so Luke places it before Jesus' death. Matthew places it after. I kind of agree with Dinesh here. I mean, this is just trivial.
That's good. That's good. And especially the curtain ripping one, like the expectation that someone they interviewed and really took the time to figure out exactly, okay, how many people are in the temple observing the temple rip? We need to go talk to each person. Okay, now let's match up our clocks to figure out, okay, this is exactly when Jesus died. And you like that type of analysis, I think, is unfair to expect of the authors. I think it's most likely to be like, hey, we know that the curtain ripped, and it ripped around the time Jesus died. So we're going to put it in there because it shows that now there's an access to the Holy of Holies. So no, thank you for that. And you threw an extra one in there that Alex didn't even mention, the Galilee and Jerusalem one. So a bonus detail for people to look at. And to me, that one is more important than the veil tearing, or at least more troublesome. But like you said,
there's a contradiction. That's a good one to point out. You know, did they change it? I mean, I get the impression that probably one changed it for one reason. Look, I'm open to contradictions and some errors in the Gospels, and acknowledge there's probably at least a handful that if we're being honest, we have to acknowledge that they are at least reasonable candidates for errors. So I'm not shy of doing that. But I just get the feeling that one of them has changed the location for some reason that eludes us today. I don't think it's being a sloppy historian or you got a poor source here. I think they did it intentionally. I just don't know why.
So tell me how you would reconcile what you just said there with what you also affirmed, that the Gospels are true and the Gospels are true and all that they teach.
They teach that Jesus appeared to his group of male disciples, and that the first appearance to the group of male disciples, the first appearance, the location of it, there's a surface contradiction here for sure. But he appeared to his group of male disciples. That is the message that's being communicated. That is what's being taught. but yeah, there's a contradiction in the process here. At least if I'm correct, that Matthew and Luke are narrating the same first appearance to the group of male disciples.
Were these? Can I ask you one more clarifying question? Now it's getting into Q&A time, apparently. But do these contradictions, did they concern the early church as they're putting the canon together? Or it seems to me that they talked about them, but they may have understood more of what was going on than we do 2,000 years later.
Yeah, for some of them it did, some it didn't. Like Augustine, it bothered him. And so at the beginning of the 5th century, he wrote a book called A Harmony of the Gospels. And this guy was the epitome of being a harmonizer. And some of them were really, really strained. So yeah, he had problems with it, with these, and he really wanted to go with harmonization efforts. On the other hand, Origen, who wrote about 150 years prior to Augustine, he said these surface contradictions did not bother him. He says they are there. They're clearly there. He said, as long as the message behind what is being taught there, he just didn't have a problem with it. And I think John Chrysostom was kind of fine with it as well. And you know what, Eusebius, he ends up saying, I'm not Eusebius, Augustine ends up saying, yeah, we have these here's what I think happened with the harmonization. But even if I'm wrong, it really only matters about the message that's behind it. So that could have been Augustine, of course, just doing that because, you know, he's going to have the word of it being the word of God no matter what, you know. But I think Origen was probably being just a little more authentic when he or honest when he's coming to the text here and seeing these surface discrepancies. They're certainly there.
Yeah, I don't know that we're going to get to it when we because we're kind of jumping around on the video, but Alex actually brings up some of what some of the harmonization Augustine did in some point. And I don't remember if it's in one of the timestamps that we did. I want to play this section, then we'll kind of fast forward. We got 3 more clips to play, and then we'll kind of close out.
It doesn't matter when the history gets it right.
What I'm saying is that if someone gives a true account of events, it is normal for the accounts to vary, to differ, in some cases to have minor contradictions. Sure. The real question is did the thing that's being described actually happen? Okay, so let's turn to that.
Do you think, for example, that the slaughter of the Amalekites that I mentioned before actually?
So that's kind of the place where I was like, there's a little feather in Dinesh's cap here, because I think he gets to kind of the crux of the matter that you do, Mike. It's like, okay, yeah, sure, there are maybe some of these surface contradictions, but the question is, did these things actually happen? It seems like we have good reason to believe that they did.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I agree.
And it's interesting because then Alex quickly swivels to kind of a moral case. What about the slaughter of the Amalekites? Like right after that, he introduces that rather than kind of perusing, oh, okay, well, if you think some of these kind of like, that would have been, to me, more interesting to go down. But then they went to the slaughter of the Amalekites, which we won't talk about here. Now, I want to be clear. It's not because we don't think there are answers to these questions. It's because primarily today we're talking about their conversation around the Gospels. Mm-hmm. So maybe some other time we'll talk about the Amalekites or the other things that Alex brought up. But the Gospels is where we're focusing now. Yeah. Tim, did you have anything to add, or should we go to the next?
No, let's just, for the sake of time, let's keep it rolling.
All right. Here's Jesus in the Old Testament, I believe. Let's make sure I actually put it on the screen this time. There we go.
Distance myself. I'm simply trying to say that any reader.
So why is that the first time you've used the word Yahweh in this conversation?
I'll tell you why. Because there is a movement within the Bible itself that you are completely missing.
Do not think that I have come
Hold
to
on, hold on,
abolish
hold
the
on.
law
Let me-
or the
let me-
prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Jesus said that in the Sermon on the Mount, referring to his fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. And
Okay, so the point that Alex is getting at here, for some more context, is Dinesh is kind of saying that there's a movement in Scripture, and that he almost falls into the whole the New Testament God's different than the Old Testament God. Kind of, it's just God's revealing Himself in different ways, and Alex goes to, well, Jesus doesn't separate Himself from the Old Testament in this Matthew chapter 5, and so Jesus is the one giving these seemingly abhorrent commands to kill the Amalekites and things of that nature. Now, I think, correct me if I'm wrong here, either of you guys, but it seems to me that Alex is pulling out of the Sermon on the Mount and then saying, well, then Jesus is talking about all of the morality of the Old Testament, the things that happened. But what Jesus is really doing there is, again, in the Sermon on the Mount, he's reinterpreting the law for the people. And so he's saying, now, even though I'm reinterpreting it, it's actually a reforming of what the law was intended for, and you guys screwed up the law. And so now I'm reinterpreting it for you. So I don't think that actually makes the point that Alex is making here. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I agree with you. Jesus did say he came to fulfill the law and the prophets. Matthew, throughout his gospel, has many occasions where he says Jesus fulfilled, thus he fulfilled Scripture in doing this, etc. But I agree with you. He offers his interpretation of this. So right after Jesus says, whoever annuls one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same, that person will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever keeps and teaches them, that person will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. And then he says, for I tell you that unless your righteousness greatly exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. So he's pretty strong on the law here. But then he does, Josh, what you said. He goes on and he interprets this because at that point there was a lot of legalism amongst the Pharisees and Sadducees, where you can't do this. In fact, in order to keep you from breaking the Sabbath, we're going to even say that you can't even do this to feed yourself on the Sabbath, and you can't do this, and they would go beyond it. What Jesus does then, he's correcting their interpretation of the law, and he's going to get to the spirit of the law, because he's not so much concerned with the letter, he's concerned with the spirit of it. And so he makes statements like, you have heard that the ancients were told, thou shalt not kill. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother, is guilty of breaking the law. And then he goes and he says, again, it was said, you have heard that it was said, thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say to you that anyone who looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So Jesus is trying to get beyond just our mean acts, because the Pharisees were doing these acts, of course, so they could be following the law, but they were, Jesus talks about them being crooked on the inside. In fact, at one point he says it's like tombs that you whitewash, you make the outside of the tomb clean, but the inside you just have the bones of the dead. Or you clean the outside of the cup, but the inside of the cup is filthy. He says this elsewhere. So what Jesus wants is like, okay, you don't have to commit murder. I mean, you don't have to commit murder here in order to be sinning. You can hate your brother and be sinning. You don't have to actually get in bed with another woman who's not your wife and have sex with her in order to commit adultery. Guys, if you're laying in bed at night next to your wife, but you are dreaming, or not dreaming, but your mind is filled with having sex
Fantasizing.
with your
Yeah.
neighbor or another woman, fantasizing having sex with a woman who's not your wife, you've in essence committed adultery in your heart. I'm not looking for merely you being holy in your actions. I want you to be holy on the inside. That is what the law is all about. And that's what I think is going on here. So I think you hit that on the nail, Josh.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. And this goes to, I saw a video of Dennis Prager the other day talking about animated pornography, animated, and I think it's animated child, that word. I don't want to get too many strikes on the YouTube channel, you know. And he says he has no problem with it because it's not an action. You know, it's not actually physically harming anyone. And it's abhorrent to us because, to me, he's actually still interpreting. He's an Orthodox Jew. He's still interpreting the law by the letter of the law. Well, if you're not actually doing it, then it's not wrong. Whereas us, we go, well, no, that's wrong because on the inside, I am thinking about doing this. And I think we see that that's what the Christian worldview has done for morality in our culture. That most people would hear Dennis Prager say that and say, that's disgusting. They don't know why. I think it's because of the Sermon on the Mount. That's why.
Well, we see both Jesus and Paul being so concerned with how we think. And that's one of the reasons why we named this organization FreeThinking Ministries, is because, you know, I mean, just look at Paul. He talks about how we're commanded to take our thoughts captive to obey Christ, and also warns us that we can be taken captive by bad thinking. And so, as Christopher Yuan has noted, and I quoted him in my book, you know, the thinking precedes the actions. And so, a sinful action can actually cause more damage, but it's still just as evil to just fantasize about evil in your mind, even if you don't actually do it. The thought life is, Jesus was really concerned about our thought life, and if we get our thoughts right, typically our actions follow.
Yeah, and the book of James is going to expand more on that, but we're sermonizing now. Sorry. This is the last clip. I think it's an answer that Dinesh is giving about these things that Alex has just talked about, some of the stuff that we've talked about. This is the answer that Dinesh gives.
You've got a spirit of forgiveness. So what I'm getting at is to pretend like you don't have this. I mean, Christianity is named after Christ. It's based on Christ as a fulfillment of the Old Testament. But what does fulfillment mean? It actually means transcendence. In Abraham's time, blood sacrifices are normal, right? When Christ comes as a sacrifice, Christ is the lamb. The point is, those blood sacrifices aren't necessary anymore. Listen, that's the Christian reading. And you keep filibustering me because you know that the Bible is showing a movement in a direction, and to miss the movement is to miss the Bible. Let's look at God in the Bible.
Hold on.
Let me make one quick point about God in the Bible.
There's nothing quick about what you're doing, Dinesh. There's nothing quick about what you're doing. I need you to be allowed to respond to what you're saying. I'm getting sick when
you're cross-examining me on the justice of smiting the Amalekites. Honestly, I don't see any justice in it, but I do agree that was the eye for an eye ethic of the Old Testament that is repudiated and transformed and transfigured in the New.
Okay, so this is where it kind of really went off the rails for me. He accuses Alex of filibustering, but Dinesh was doing most of the talking throughout a lot of that debate. And then he says something like, well, and then you talk about the slaughter of the Amalekites. I don't see the morality in it, but that's not the point. So general thoughts on this part. He says that, what does he say that what does he say that means transcendence? I can't remember what he said, what Dinesh said. Fulfillment means transcendence, like basically going above and beyond the law, that eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth is actually repudiated in the New Testament. There's a lot there. So some general thoughts of that response. Agree with some, disagree with some. What are some thoughts?
In the context, what was he referring to? What was he answering?
He was answering the charge that the Old Testament links to the New, and that Jesus is, and I hope I'm getting this right as I'm trying to remember, and that Jesus is, according to Alex, inextricably linked to the Old Testament. And so if Jesus really is who he says he is, then he's commanding the slaughter of the Amalekites. And if you say that that's immoral, then somehow Jesus is immoral, that sort of thing. And Dinesh kind of responded this way.
I'd have to give that some thought, Josh. I don't know exactly what to say right now. I mean, Jesus does say in the Sermon on the Mount, he did not come to abolish the law and the prophets. He came not to abolish, but to fulfill them.
Mhm.
Does that mean that everything that happens in the Old Testament, I mean, that he approves of? Does he approve of the rape and all of that? Did he approve of when a woman is raped by a man in the field, that now that man must marry her? I don't, here we're getting into the area of what do we mean by inspiration, and what was Jesus actually referring to here when he's he's linked to the Old Testament, yes, and he's interpreting things here. That's for sure. But I don't know how Alex comes to the conclusion that therefore Jesus is commanding the genocide in the Old Testament. Now, I have to admit, when you see these texts, genocide texts, they make me uncomfortable. There are many occasions I just don't like to read the Old Testament. I'm just being honest with you. I don't like to read it a lot of times because of some of the stuff I read in it. Now, Paul Copan and Matthew Flanagan, in their book, Did God Command Genocide in the Old Testament? I find that their answers for this are pretty compelling.
Mhm.
And how they talk about it, that you have hyperbolic language that is going on here.
Yeah.
Michael Heiser, I heard him give a short thing on the Amalekites, I think it was, and that made a whole lot of sense, what he said about killing them.
Mhm.
I think in some case there's hyperbole, like what you have with Copan and Flanagan, but boy, probably going out on some ground that is going to offend some people. But I think we can see moral justification for some of this stuff. Some of these societies were absolutely evil. I think we get somewhat of a moral equivalent today with Hamas over in
Right.
Gaza.
Yeah.
So, as we are recording this, it's just yesterday that a peace agreement has been signed between, or I should say the Israeli government has agreed to the peace agreement between Hamas and Israel, an agreement that was, they say, I think Netanyahu said Trump was largely responsible for making it happen. Whether that holds, I doubt it. But what they showed was you had a lot of Israelis who were excited about this, although I've heard maybe 70% are not. They want Hamas destroyed entirely. But you saw some people over in Gaza, crowds just rejoicing about that and what happened on October 7th of 2023, and saying this is going to happen again, and death to Jews and all this stuff. And it's like, kids are saying this, and the kids are, and wives, the women's, you can see the wives saying the same stuff. We're going to kill every Jew. We're going to continue to do an October 7th thing. This is not going to stop until every Jew is executed. I think there's moral justification in that case to just bomb it and wipe them all out.
Well, let me add.
Huh?
Can I just jump in here and say this regarding if it was God's commands to do that? I'm going to bring in Molinism again. So we can see with Hamas just how infected the entire place is, even down to the little kids, to everybody there. And if God knows in his middle knowledge that it's not going to get better, it's just going to keep getting worse, then it would be justifiable, I think. I mean, for the first time in my life, I had the feelings of, wow, maybe they should just just destroy that whole place because it's just such a cancer.
Mhm.
I mean, I'm not saying they should do that. I'm just saying for the first time ever, I had those feelings, and I did do as you did, Mike, and compare that to some of these Old Testament passages. But yeah, if God has middle knowledge, counterfactual knowledge, and he would know with certainty that, yeah, this is not going to get any better, and therefore it would be justified. But just really quickly, and I'll give it back to you, Mike. I've written a couple articles if people are interested on our website, freethinkinc.org or freethinkingministries.com. One is called Homosexuality, Tattoos, and the Sabbath, how the Old Testament law does or does not apply today. And the other is called 10 Problems with the Canaanite Objection. I wasn't dealing specifically with the Amalekites there, but a lot of the same things are going to be answered. So I would just point people to our website. I wrote those years ago, so I might want to make some updates. I need to go back and look at them, but good place to start. But I do also recommend Paul Copan's work, Is God a Moral Monster?, where he really focuses on a lot of these Old Testament issues. So I interrupted you, Mike. I'll let you finish your.
No, that's good stuff, Tim, and
Cool.
and that's fine. Now, the only other thing, I mean, I was going to add there just one more thing. I feel for the Christian Palestinians
Yes.
who live in Gaza, because they're typically not for this, and there are other, even Muslims over there, who don't want this. They're against Hamas, but polls have showed that the large majority of Palestinians in Gaza are for Hamas, and unfortunately, in every war, innocent people die.
Yeah.
It's an unfortunate fact, but innocent people die. But I think that, when you talk about some of these genocide texts in the Old Testament, you could say that there could be moral justification for it, especially when you've got to protect the Jewish nation so that the Messiah can come through it.
Yeah. Mike,
and there's a few
you referenced, let me say this really quick.
Okay.
Mike, you referenced our trip to Israel, and on that same trip, David Wood and I went across Jerusalem during some of our free time to meet with a Christian Palestinian who was able to come meet with us there. And during that conversation, I said, "Hey, don't you?" Because he kept talking about how Israel needed to be destroyed as a Christian.
Wow.
Palestinian, and I said, "But don't you see this? So many Jews for Jesus or Messianic Jews now coming." I said, "So what would you do with all of them?" And he goes, "Oh yes, they are my brothers in Christ, but we must still kill them." And I was like,
"Wow,
so
I did not know that, Tim."
Christian, yeah. Dave was there with me, so
he can vouch for it. Yeah.
Wow.
I was amazed. Yeah. So just I left there thinking, wow, if even I'm not going to say that he spoke for all Christians. I am sure there's some Christian Palestinians who do not think like him, but I was just amazed and just saddened and realized just how infected the culture there is. But we got to keep praying for him.
Yeah.
So
for sure.
One last thing I'll say in regards to this clip is there's two things. One, I also wrote an article called "The Joshua's Conquest and God's Moral Consistency" or something like that. So that's on our website. But there's I guess maybe two or three things. One is, remember that Jesus, when they asked Jesus, "Hey, why would Moses allow for a certificate of divorce?" Jesus said, "Because he knew your hearts were hardened." So he knew you were stubborn. So there are things that happen in the Old Testament that even God allows to happen that are because he was creating through his middle knowledge, he was molding history to receive his son.
Yeah.
And so over time, he's got to, because in the fullness of time, that's when Jesus came. So these events need to occur. So when people say, well, why didn't God just show up and say, hey, no owning people, no slavery? There is an arc of history. There is God doing stuff throughout history. And I think that's part of it. And we can see that in the biblical text, just hints of it when he goes, well, God allowed for divorce because because of your hardness of heart. And that could be the case for other things as well, that if we asked God, well, why did you allow this in the Old Testament? That could be a similar response. Well, because of their hardness of heart. I wanted to soften their hearts for the reception of my son.
But just to add, Josh, in the very first book of the Bible, in Genesis 50, it does make it clear that selling people into slavery against their will is evil, because it says what you meant for evil. Well, what was that? Selling Joseph into slavery against his will. So we do. I mean, people say, why doesn't the Old Testament say that that slavery was evil? Well, actually, go read Genesis.
Yeah. At the very least, selling your own sibling is evil. That's at the very least. So there's part of it, and then the other part of it is I think there's something to be said of some of these conquests, some of the bans in the conquest of the Old Testament, of some of these places being military outposts and not outright settlements. Jericho, Ai, it seems that they were more outposts than settlements, so it's more militaristic than just going and attacking Omaha, Nebraska. Like all of a sudden, the police need. No, it's an outpost, and so I think there's an argument to be made there as well. But I think when you say, well, Jesus is the one commanding all these things, there's this kind of switch where Alex is choosing to be the arbiter of history in that moment. He's choosing to say, well, if I were God as Alex O'Connor, these things wouldn't have happened. And the movie Bruce Almighty comes to mind, where it's like, hey, if I were God, I would give everyone an answer yes to their prayer. And then Bruce finds out that actually that throws the world wildly into chaos. So God knows things that we don't know as well. So I think that would be kind of the end of the debate. Any closing thoughts, as we only touched on a few topics in the debate, but generally speaking, thank you, Mike, for coming on. Any closing thoughts on what we did?
Yeah, of course, as you know, because I've written 2 books on gospel differences, that it is a topic that interests me. And I know that it is a topic that interests many Christians. But at the end of the day, as I've said before, if Jesus rose from the dead, it's game, set, match. Christianity's true, period. And if there are errors in the contradictions in the Gospels, that doesn't nullify the truth of Christianity if Jesus rose from the dead. And I do think that there's really good evidence that he did rise from the dead. So once you settle in your heart and mind that Jesus rose, then just some of these things, they just don't seem to bother you anymore. It's just they're a matter of curiosity. And I'm not trying to say it's not important. It's just, I mean, obviously I'm curious about it because of the time, 11 years that I've devoted to looking at this stuff. But I think ultimately it pales in its importance in comparison to something like the question, did Jesus rise from the dead?
So, Mike, if you had a closing message for both Dinesh D'Souza and for Alex O'Connor, what would it be?
Well, I'd say, Alex, I actually admire you. I think that I've seen a few things of yours, not a whole lot. I've saw both of your interviews with Richard Dawkins and one with William Lane Craig. That's the extent of what I've seen. And I've been impressed. You come across to me as perhaps the fairest of all the atheists I've ever heard. So, and you're a bright guy. And so, yeah, there's a degree of admiration I have for you and respect for you. I hope that you'll just maybe see that there are some things that are a lot more important than some of what you've raised, and focus on the resurrection. Because if that event actually occurred, that may change your view on the importance of some of these other things. And then to Dinesh, I'd say, hey, I've seen some of your things over the years. I really admire what you're doing in politics, and I'm on the same side. So I'd say keep up the good work there. And I think you've done some good stuff in apologetics, but I'd like to see you focus more on the political stuff, because I think that's where you really shine, brother.
Good words.
That's good. Well, thank you, Mike, for joining us, and Tim, thank you as well. This is good. Hopefully anybody watching this found that helpful. And again, extending the invitation. I don't know if you'll ever see this, Alex or Dinesh, but we'd love to have a conversation with you guys too. I know Mike would love to have a conversation, especially with you, Alex, just about some of the stuff you've given rise to here. So God bless you until next time. And as we all say here at Free Thinking Ministries,
stay reasonable.